Hello, and welcome to the Be Formless Flow Driven CEO podcast, where we are reshaping life, leadership, and business from the inside out. And boy, oh boy, is this going to be probably my most compelling pod interview yet, because I am welcoming to the show today John Shewell. Welcome to the show, John.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And the reason I say compelling, but also, that's not even the right word, is it really, John? Because we've met a few times now. And when I first reached out to you, you were like, you kind of almost just kind of stopped me in my tracks with all these questions. And I was like, "Oh, wow, he's not just going to come on the show. He wants to actually go deep. And we're going to go deep today." And then you wanted to meet up, and then you wanted to talk about what we were going to talk about. And you made me really, I guess, what's what I'm looking for here? But I guess for me, it was like this was going to be not just an everyday conversation. Not that I have had all of those with the different people I've met, but you were making me go deeper. And my journey in the last few years has been around this deep inner work that I've been doing on myself. But it was weird how we got connected. And then all of a sudden I meet you and you're like, oh my God, oh, here we go. And so I say that because this is probably, going to be for 2026, one of my most influential interviews I've had for the year. And I know I'm going to reflect back on this one because, you opened something up in me and I thought I'd evolved enough. And then here we are again. So anyway, I've gone on a little bit enough about that. But
You've really
first
talked
things
me
first,
up there. You put me under a bit of pressure here.
I have put you under a bit of pressure, but you called yourself a European vagabond, and you actually are an Aussie through and through at heart. You've still got a little bit of an accent. So you were a Gold Coast boy and grew up on the Goldie, and one of my favorite places. And you're like, why would you want to, But I'm like, come on, John, it's a good place. But you have been 25 years in Europe and spent probably the most amount of time in London, 17 years, most recently Berlin, 5.5 years. And now you're dancing between Krakow in Poland, which is where you are right now, and London. And let's just talk a
Yeah.
little bit about your career, and then we'll get into the cycles of John and the current cycle that you're in that I'm yet to be exposed to myself. And I said, let's just hold and let's just wait till we get on the pod. So you were Director of Global Communication and Public Affairs at WeFox, where you scale the business to 4.5 billion within a 5-year period, which is huge. Like that's 4.5 billion, not millions. So I kind of go, wow. And you were then had an executive, you were a partner with Delta, the venture builder, and an ecosystem work, and you were recognized on the Propel 100 list of influential fintech professionals back in 2023. But you said you were the top 1% of fintech comms. I think I've got that right. Have I got that right, John? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
right. That's right. Yeah.
and in the last couple of years, you've started your own company, which is an AI native. And I'm looking down at this because I'm trying to sense check my writing. It's an AI native startup that's building agents. The company is called Merlin, and it's building agents to essentially automate research and insights for critical decision makers. And essentially, you said you're about to introduce a new product called Groundswell, and it's an intelligence platform, if you like. So you've got a backstory to all this amazing career success, and you've got quite a few cycles of John, as I do quite a few cycles of B. And I think that's why when you kind of stopped me in my track towards the end of last year, I was hitting another cycle, and it was like you just tapped into it, and you called me on a bit of my own shit at one point. I don't think you even remember this. And I was like, who is this person? And here we are. So I've talked for 4 minutes or 5, and I'm going to hand it over to you to tell us a little bit about yourself. And we've got a few things that we are going to talk about, but most probably the big thing is this inner light and the invitation into the test, because those are the cycles of John. Over to you.
B, well, that's a heck of an introduction. And as I said, you've really built me up there. So, but thank you. And thank you for inviting me onto your show. Yeah. So yeah, I'm an Australian, but actually I was born in Papua New Guinea. So my mother's from Papua New Guinea. I was I was actually born there. My father's Australian, and I grew up in Papua New Guinea to begin with. And then I think about the age of 11, I I went to Australia. I went to school in Australia, boarding school, and through university, had my first job and career in Australia. And like all good Aussies, there's a rite of passage, which is you've got to go traveling for a bit.
Totally.
And my game
I
plan,
did it.
yeah, totally, totally. And all my mates at uni, we're all gallivanting around Europe, and I was just receiving messages about how much of a great time they were having. So obviously, I needed to be a part of that. So, the plan was to roll up my swag and just go for 2 years. That's the usual stint. You've got your stripes, come back. Uh, anyway,
How old were you, John? Sorry, how old were you when you did it?
I was
How old were
I
you?
was 25. I was 25
Yeah,
at the
so was
time, so I'd
I.
finished.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd finished uni. Obviously, started working for a bit, but yeah, I was 25. I thought I was, older and mature. Look back on it now and think, yeah, not really. I was just a kid. But I jumped on a plane, flew to Europe. I didn't have a job. I probably arrived in Europe when it was London to be precise. I got to London. It was shitty cold. I remember that much getting off the plane. It was about November of 2001. So it was just after September 11, that shocking terrorist attack in
Yeah.
New York. And, it was a very febrile mood. Everyone was a little bit nervous. But, like all good Aussies, you've got that optimism, and you go out and embrace the world and also massively ignorant as well. So that helps. You're like, throw caution
Totally.
to the wind. Let's see. So, off I went, rocked up to London, no job, no place really to stay. I didn't really have anything actually. And I'd miscalculated how much money you needed to be in London. So
Yeah.
I turned
Totally.
up.
Totally.
But, I had the good grace of mates who gave me, their apartments. These were Aussies. They were kind of going back to Australia for Christmas and they said, look, stay in our apartment. So I had somewhere to crash for a bit. But yeah, it took me a little while to find a job whilst I watched my bank account get drained, super fast. So that was the first realization check after landing and freezing my butt off, thinking, well, what have I done here? I've just left Australia, the Gold Coast, pretty much,
I'd say of all
summertime.
places, the sunniest state of the pretty much of the
That's right. I
country.
literally went from the sunny state to cold ass, the end of the
Yeah.
earth kind of thing. That was
Yeah.
my thought process. But anyway, I just kind of mucked in. I couldn't find a job in my chosen field of profession, so I was working in kind of public affairs and stuff like that for a great firm back in Brizzy called Brumfield Bird and Sanford. So shout out to those folks. Still remember them fondly. And yeah, so I took a job in London at a bar, right?
Of
And
course
just
you
it
did.
was a cocktail bar. Honestly, best way to get to know a city. I highly
Yes.
recommend it to any young traveler. To go out there, and you meet some real characters. So, and I really forged a lot of really good mates there. And it was actually a bar run by mostly Aussies, which was a
Mm,
bonus, and they were also travelers. So, there was a kinship already there.
yeah.
And it was such a great way. So I spent, a few months working at this bar, just kind of getting pennies back into the bank account. And then I landed a job at a firm in London and kind of things kind of progressed from there. I stayed in London. 2 years flew by, and I was obviously traveling, I'd save up money and I'd travel around Europe and come back, that sort of thing.
On the
And
bus about
it
at
just
all? I
happens
I did bus about. Did you ever do bus
that,
about?
no, what's bus about? Well, that sounds interesting.
Bus about was like there was the Kentucky tour, but then there was like the bus about, and the bus about was basically you jump on and you jump off, but it wasn't the expensive
Yeah,
Kentucky.
got it now. Yeah. We called it was still, when I was in London, it was called Tiki Tour, right?
That's
No, I
well,
didn't
yeah,
do
this
it.
is
I was,
faster.
yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't do it. I heard so many stories. I was like, I don't want to get caught up in that nonsense. I'm staying away from it. So I gave it a wide berth. But no, basically 2 years came and went, and I was like, what happened there? And I thought I'll
Mm.
give it another 2 years. That also came and went. So next thing you know, I was up to 5 years, and I thought after that, I was like, you know what, bugger it. I'll just stay. I was having a great time. I was loving London. I was really, and I was starting to live all, different parts of London. My career was starting to take off in London. I was working at this agency. I left the agency after about 2 years. Took 6 months off when traveling around, like, North Africa and all of Europe and all
Amazing.
of this, again, what Aussies do with a backpack.
Yeah.
I think I got like halfway down Morocco and realized I'd run out of money and had to like leg it back to London to get another job,
Yeah.
good times, really. I really love that. Character shaping stuff, to be honest with you. I look
100%.
back on it now and I think, oh, God, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
But my career then took off in London. I went and worked in government, relations, starting at local government and then working my way up. Then, by the time I hadn't even turned 30 yet, I'd become director of communications for a very large government organization. So I was one of the youngest, if not the youngest in the UK to have given this job. Next thing you know, I was writing articles in media magazines about like, my role and things and being asked to give my input. And I was like, wow, within 10 years of like touching, on these
Yeah.
shores, here I am doing this. And so, next thing I thought, you know what, I'm just going to carve out a career here. So, I did that. I spent quite a lot of time in the world of politics. I learned so much, being at the intersection of politics and media, especially UK media, which is probably the toughest media in the world. I
Yeah.
mean, people talk about the Australian media, they're not, the old terminology was the Fleet Street media, but they're not technically in Fleet Street anymore. They've
Mm.
been dispersed. But just the cut and thrust of UK media, the cut and thrust of UK politics really sharpened my professional skills. But, that's when kind of things started getting a little bit wobbly for me. I think that's when I started to go through one of my own cycles, and we'll probably get into that a little bit more. But, for the sake of kind of wrapping up, my professional journey, and we can talk about the personal stuff going forward. But then I kind of stepped away from, the world of political communications and went as an independent for a while. And then I got tapped on the shoulder by a company called WeFox, which was a startup in Berlin. Now, I'd been dabbling around fintech communications a little bit, but I'd never worked in an insurtech. I didn't even know what that meant, to be honest with you. And I
Really?
remember speaking to the floats. Yeah, yeah. And I remember speaking to them, and they sounded like an interesting company, and I met the CEO, this guy called Julian Tyker, who was just an incredible CEO. Really, never met anyone like him. And I remember walking in the room and I said, oh, like, I need to lay cards on the table here. Like, I've never really worked in insurtech. And they're like, yeah, we know, it's all right. And I was like, okay. And I said, and I can't speak German. They said, perfect. And I was like, wow, these guys are crazy. And I said, okay. I said, what do you want? And they said, we want you to help us become the best insurtech in the world. And I was like, I'm in.
Was that your first coming back to the inner light, right? Or I know we're gonna move into the personal stuff, but this was almost like you're the first. I feel like whether it was your first cycle, but this was your, because you talked to me about the invitation to the test. Was this your? Do you see
Mm.
this as your first invitation to the test? Because when we met
Well,
previously, you
yeah, I know
said
where you're
this
going with it.
came up, and this,
This was the lead up. This was the lead
yeah,
up. So,
yeah,
and we can come on to it. I'll just close off that part of the story,
yes,
right?
I'm getting
I don't
excited.
know. It's
Sorry,
it. I know where you're going with it, and I'll be more than happy to kind of delve deeper into how that came about, because it's an
yeah,
interesting
cool.
journey of which I'm kind of going through a second cycle now. So we had this kind of exchange. They were an interesting company, and I had this inner instinct that this was the company I was meant to go and work at. Yeah. But they didn't give me the job straight away, and there was a bit of toing and froing, and but I eventually got the job. And I remember a bunch of people saying to me, look, give up on these folks. Don't go work for them. They're not going to give you the job. And I was like, I think they will. Anyway, and they offered me like a 2-month contract to initially to get started with them, just 2 months. And I remember a friend of mine at the time, actually was a girlfriend at the time, and she said to me, Yeah, this is how much confidence she had in me. She goes, forget it. They're never going to hate it. And I remember looking at it and I was dead serious. And I said, that, I said, that, I said, you don't understand. I said, that 2-month contract, I said, I'm there. I'm done. I'm going to be there for a very long time. And she thought I was insane, right? I look back on it now, I think probably I was a bit, but I knew. I was like, the
Intuitively.
minute, yeah, and I remember turning up, right? And they said, right, we've got 2 months, we'll get started. And I was just like, no problems, get out of my way. And yeah, you have to put this in context. I mean, I didn't know anything about insurtech. I'd never worked in insurance before. I didn't know how a startup went. I didn't know how. So I was like, God, but I knew I was like a duck to water in that place. Anyway, so 2 years turned into 5 years plus.
Yeah.
And
Scaling
I
to front
worked
up.
on that company. Yeah, and then I helped scale that company's brand, right? The reputation of WeFox into the world's #1 insurtech. I got to learn everything about insurtech. I got to understand everything about fintech, right? And I had the rare privilege of working on the funding rounds, one of which was a Series C funding round of 650 million, which was a world record at the time that we closed. So, I went from somebody that didn't know anything about this stuff to this. And then, of course, I got to work with Delta as a venture partner there, and that's helping to scale their venture companies, which is owned and founded by Julian Teicher, the CEO of WeFox, whom I began to forge a very close relationship with. And getting to see the inner mechanics of how you build a company from the ground up was just
Mm.
mind-blowing. And this was what they call blitz scaling, right? Being able to build a company from
I've never heard
zero.
that term, John. I've never heard it.
Yeah,
Blitzscaling.
it's blitz scaling. It's really just going full tilt. I mean, this is what it took. I mean, there were days where I would stay awake for 3 days straight,
Yeah, I've
right,
done
to get a
those.
job done.
It's
And
crazy.
so this was, the intense of the intense. So I did that for five years, and I learned so much from it. And of course, I also saw a few problems there that I thought, I could solve this if I was given the right tools. Well, those right tools happened to appear in the form of AI, and I knew that we could probably build some of these intelligence tools better to be able to make better decision making in real time. That's just really because that's what I was working on, and I was involved with a lot of engagements with partners, investors, media, and I always operate in the context of rich intelligence in that moment to know exactly how to engage. So I
Mm.
stepped aside and decided to create a company called Merlin, which is the one that I'm currently building now. And because I had been exposed to fundraising, how you go and raise money from investors, I understood a little bit about how to do that. But within 4 weeks of founding the company, or at least having the idea, and literally, notes on the back of a fag pack, I wouldn't raise the round, right? So, and again, I kind of quickly look back and this is where we can now segue into the personal stuff, because 5 years from that point, I was nearly broke. Yeah, I was really struggling. And I went from that point to, and I had shares in WeFox that were very healthy. Let's say, I could retire from that kind of stuff. I'd got myself into a financial position that was virtually, I couldn't even dream of, because 5 years prior, I was really like on my knees. So the journey was incredible.
Mm.
I went from basically being broken in every conceivable way possible, emotionally, almost mentally, definitely financially. And then suddenly being here going and closing around within 4 weeks for my own thing. And I remember sitting down, and it was actually at Christmas, and looking back going, on my language, I need to swear here, but
No,
going,
go for it.
fuck me.
There's no holding back here.
No.
This is like a free-flowing
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah, really. It was literally, like, I was like, fuck me. Wow. What's going on here? But I knew what was going on. I really did. And as I said, this is where it's a nice segue into that personal stuff. Because that was a journey, but I knew that was just only now the beginning. So, I'm currently experiencing a similar, but I'm in a different space. So it's not, as broke, but the intensity of that experience of going through into another cycle is the same. It's also very painful, and I'm currently going through it, but this time I'm a lot more aware of what's happening. I'm more open to it. I'm more inviting it in. And I know what happens now, having experienced it, where it takes me. So
Mm,
it's almost like walking into a space where you know it's unknown, but you know that unknown space is a necessary point to enter into. That's liminal space you enter into,
yeah,
right?
for
With
evolution.
all the yeah, it is. It's kind of like a moment of kind of, unshedding. And it's really important that we unshed,
I
right?
agree.
And then re-emerge, right?
Yeah.
And when if one can kind of sit still and just allow that to happen and invite it, like be really open and allow that to come in easily, right? And the challenge is actually because it becomes uncomfortable, it really turns you inside out. And so what often happens is people resist that. Yeah.
100%.
Well,
I
that
did ages.
resistance, yeah, that resistance is what's going to,
Take
it'll
you over
take you
the
one
edge.
of two ways. Yeah. It'll either take you over the edge or you're going to soar. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm
I
going
think
through
I
that
had
now.
to
And again,
be
we can talk
sorry,
about it.
John, but sorry, John, I think I had to be tipped over the edge though, and I'd love your thoughts on this. I think I had to be tipped over the edge to then now soar. Like, you know how you're talking about these cycles? I feel like I'm coming into a soaring cycle, if you like. Like I'm listening to you intently around, the 5 years and, like you're like, what the actual fuck? Like seriously, like you go from, on your knees, in every way, shape, and form to then how did I like, whoa, and now you're in another cycle, if you like, different cycle by the sounds of things. But I don't know about you, but like I resisted it and then all of a sudden it was just like had to go, had to go. I feel like as much as I like someone asked me the other day, do you have any regrets or mistakes? And I'm like, I don't believe in that. I just believe that I wish I had a surrendered sooner was my response, right?
Mm.
But I kind of feel like I had to, yeah, in the dark to then come out in the light. And if I had to just,
Well,
like, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, sorry, I interrupted you, but you know
yeah,
what I'm saying?
I absolutely do. But here's my thought on it. And again, what I'm going to share with you is just my
Go for
own
it.
experience. People will go
Yeah.
through their own. So I'm in no way, shape, or form an expert in this stuff. I don't even know if I'm an expert in John Shewell, right? Because it's a constant
Sorry, I
iteration.
should have, like,
Well,
that's cool.
no, but it's if you step back a bit, you're kind of an author of your own story, but you don't know what each day is going to hold. So you're kind of literally writing in real time, and you're forging that. So you've got an idea, and you're trying to manifest that into the real world, but it doesn't actually go according to your exact way. Yeah,
Never.
and part of that is just to kind of like just sit in that and iterate as you well it's kind of a strange iteration, right? Because you're doing it near real time. As I said, there are certain things that you'll do. I know I'll get up in the morning, go and have breakfast. I have my routines that I follow near religiously. I get up fairly early in the morning, go and have a cold shower, right?
Have your
Then
coffee.
after the cold shower, yeah, then I'll go and make a nice brew, coffee, and let that cool off on the hot plate, and then I'll go and meditate, right, for 15 minutes, and then after that I'll go and then obviously pour my coffee, get myself set, and then look at my day, right, and go through what I've got to. But as I'm going through my day, I'll be then listening to all the news, right. But I do that almost every day, right. So there are certain things I know I'm going to do.
Mm.
And then I top and tail my day by in the evenings, I'll do a similar routine to close off the day, right? Minus the coffee, minus the cold shower. So, it'll be going to the gym, having maybe a sauna, very, short sauna, and then meditate in the evening, go to bed, right? So top and tail. In between that, that's the
Powering up
negotiation.
and powering down, by the way. I call it that, powering up and powering down. You're powering up
Yeah.
for the day, powering down for the day.
I don't know about powering up. Definitely powering down. I don't know about powering up, but I think after a nice cold shower, I'm already the button switched on because the showers over here are bloody cold. I can tell you that
Yeah.
much.
I
But
can't imagine.
but I think this much, B. I think that my own truth of this, and again, I'm going to speak from my own perspective, is that often when we encounter these situations, and you called it, being pushed kind of over the edge, but often when we encounter these situations of going into the dark, what really the invitation here is actually, and the way you start seeing in the dark is obviously you need light, but the thing is that you are the light, and so the invitation is to become that,
Mm.
and that's the point of awakening. That's my personal view. I haven't studied the stuff like, but you awaken the light from within,
Mm.
and once you awaken the light from within, yes, you can start seeing all the scary stuff around. I mean, and you can't always see it all, but it gives you a bit more confidence about this is the direction now I need to kind of go. The challenge then is holding the light. That's the
Yes, trying to
challenge.
use I agree.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit I know you're gonna go deeper in that, but holding that light, like, can you elaborate a bit more on, what you mean by that, please?
Yeah, yeah. I think the way in which I can answer that question is to go a little bit back into kind of how I arrived there and why I describe it in that manner. So again, I'm going to go back probably 8, 9 years ago, nearly a decade, right? Where in that moment I experienced what was essentially an existential crisis. And I really mean that, an existential crisis, as in, do I really want to exist? Yeah. I was going through a really dark period and the world just didn't feel great for me. I was in an extremely dark place. I felt like no matter what I tried to do was not working. And what I came to realize, and I remember this very well, it was coming up to Christmas, I think in 2017. Yeah, 2017. I, I remember distinctly just thinking to myself, right, like everything's pretty fucked at the minute. Like my kind of career wasn't really progressing from where it was before.
Yeah.
And I was in this state of deep funk. I couldn't figure out like which way I wanted to really go. I was not, not feeling particularly engaged with anything that, even though I thought it was meaningful, it really wasn't, right? But also, I was being easily distracted by, a lot of kind of social gatherings, a lot of things that just didn't really have a lot of purpose or value. And I'll come on to that, like real deep meaning. These are more
Mm.
superficial distractions, go out, get pissed, do all of those sorts
Yeah.
of things, be
Trauma
fools.
trauma, ignoring
Yeah,
doing the work and just I've
yeah,
done
yeah.
that.
Yeah, these are distractions. They're just nice distractions because you don't want to
Totally.
face the real truth of what's going on. But anyway, and what had happened was that I was in a relationship at the time, and my relationship fell apart, and that was on top of everything else, and so that got bad. And then I my financial situation was just going downhill. And I remember this really well. It was a December time, Christmas. And I thought to myself, this is so fucked. Like, what's the point of it all? Like, really, I got to that very dark place. I remember one evening I went to bed and I had the strangest dream. No word of a lie, and it scared the shit out of me. And the dream basically went like this. I was walking down a fucking path and it was well lit, and I reached a point in the road of this path and it forked, right? And one path to the left was completely dark and scary. And everything else around me was dark and scary, right? Except for these lights
Smelling
that led me
better.
to the path. And then there was another path to the right, was really well lit. Really well lit. And I looked down to the left and I thought, fuck that. I'm not going that way. I'm going to the right. And as I went to walk to the right hand side of the path, a voice came over in my dream, said, "You sure you want to go that way?" And I was like, who the fuck's that? You know? And the voice just basically
So
said,
crazy.
you know where that path goes, right? You know, if you think things are bad now, that's guaranteed, right? It was along those lines. Basically, the conversation was, if you keep walking that path, you know where that path goes and you're going to die for sure, for sure. And that scared me more. And I looked down to the left side and I was like, I don't know, that's dark.
Yeah, where the fuck
And
is this?
so in my dream, I was like, fuck it, I'm going that way because that one's scaring me more. Like the known path scares me more. Anyway, I remember waking up, right? And I was like, fuck, what's going on? What's
Were you
going on?
sweating? Like, were you just like, did you feel like you were like, did you wake up kind of pretty
No, I
like
was
freaked?
freaked out. I was really freaked out, B. I was really
Yeah.
freaked out. I was like,
I would have been
what's
sweaty
happening?
and
Like,
yeah.
no, I just was confused. That's the truth. I was so confused. Like, what's going on? Anyway, I remember sitting at the edge of my bed and thinking to myself, and I said, that's it. The first thing I'm doing is I'm quitting drinking. I haven't touched a drop of alcohol in nearly 10 years. Yeah. So I was
That's
like, I'm
amazing.
done. Yeah. Since 2017, that point.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's like 8, 9 years now. So I was
Yeesh.
like, I'm done. Yeah. I'm not touching that stuff. Right. Because I thought, okay, this alcohol stuff's really, playing with my brain,
That's what you said.
Yeah, like, oh, fuck, no more. So that was the first action I did. But then I remember sitting down thinking to myself, look, and I have a son, right? And I remember thinking, look, if anything, do this for your son. That's the most
Mm,
important thing, right?
mm.
Get your shit together. And then I remember thinking, like, why do I keep thinking, everything's so fucked for me? Like, what's going on? So I remember, and I'm kind of a person that likes to kind of like figure stuff out, right? So bearing in mind, I didn't have anyone to talk to, or at the very least, I wasn't comfortable to talk to anyone about it. And I didn't really feel up for it. But I
And
remember
is that
getting a
because, sorry, John, just quickly, can we just pause there for a second? And I'm going to ask you one question. Is that because you, as a man, as a male, didn't feel like you could, like that it wasn't a male, like a man doesn't has the ability, or wasn't it
nah,
was had nothing to do with that?
nothing. I'll tell you what it
Yeah,
had to
okay.
do with. It had to do with me being able to articulate it clearly to myself first.
Yeah, okay. There you go. Yeah, get it.
Because
I
my
get that.
concern was I could articulate it to somebody. The interpretation could be wrong because I haven't fully articulated it properly to myself.
Yes, I get that.
And suddenly we're talking about, and I'm like, and then I'm having to struggle to pull them back, and then they might think, So I was like, let me understand this first. What the hell's going on inside John Shewell? Yeah. So let's get that conversation with John Shewell right first. Yeah. And
Mm,
at the end of the day, B, that is the most important conversation, because here's the truth of all truths. You are actually alone.
I know.
Yeah. You are actually alone. Yes, you've got friends and stuff like that, but no one's sitting inside your head truly understanding you. So you've got to
No
get that
one's sitting
conversation
inside of
completely
you.
bang
I
on.
know. Yeah.
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 That conversation, because sometimes what you think, what comes out here, you're like, sometimes you say stuff and you go, no, that's not how I thought about it.
I know.
That does happen. Yeah, it doesn't
I
mean you're
know.
crazy. It's just, just the way you think about things, the way you articulate that. So the most important conversation you've got to have is the one with yourself. Yeah. And
Mm,
it's got to be a good conversation, grounded in truth, your truth,
mm,
right? Not somebody else's. And from your place of honor and self-respect, right? And deep care and love. It's got to come from that place. Once you can do that, and that's why people say, because that forges your first relationship properly.
mm.
Yeah. That one. So you have that conversation first with yourself, forge that wonderful conversation so that you can cultivate that wonderful relationship. And once you can start doing that, then yes, you can extend that out. It kind of
Yeah,
flows out.
totally.
So what I did was I literally took a pad and I drew a column, right? And this was my thinking, and this is what really made me kind of shift. I was thinking that everything that was happening was because of the world outside, and it was the world's problem, not mine. So I remember writing, going, why do all of these things keep happening? And I was like, right, I'm going to document this. And I wrote this list about why do all these girls keep breaking up with me? Why do they all this? Why do, why does this happen? Yeah. Why are they, why are these people arguing with me about this point? And I made this massive list. Yeah. And I go, and I saw this pattern, right? Then so that was the first part. What I dislike and why does it keep happening? When I was going through it, I was looking at the pattern and I was like, fuck, there's a pattern emerging here. And then I was like, holy crap, actually, if that pattern's emerging, it means I'm creating the pattern. Right? It's not random. Patterns don't just randomly. And I was like, whoa. And then I was like, it's me. I'm the fucking problem, and then that was a massive shift in that internal narrative that I had going on to take ownership of the problem.
Yeah.
I was like,
It's huge. So profound.
I was like, oh crap, I'm the author of all of this. And that was, I could feel, I remember everything feeling like shit coming up, but also then like going through that kind of grief curve, one where you're like, oh no, that can't be true, and yeah, but the more I stared, I was like, it's fucking me, right? And I drew this other column on the other side, like, oh, if I could be the perfect human, what does that look like? And I made this list, and I remember I got halfway down the list, and I was like, wait a minute, what's this thing about if I could be? I can't, I'm that human now.
Yeah.
And that was the second part. I took ownership of that and said, I'm becoming this. I'm this person. Yeah. And that activity, as small as it may seem, was so profound of a shift for me internally. And it really,
It's not
that
small,
then
John.
set the course.
Small. It's not small. Like
Yeah,
it takes a lot to get to that point, though.
Well, it did. And then I kind of sat back a bit, right? And then I was like, I started asking myself that kind of very profound, who am I? And I was looking at this going, well, I'm clearly this person. I just haven't lived up to this person. Yeah. Because I've been living an external reality. In other words, out there. But what I discovered was actually the external world is just really a reflection of your internal world. So I thought, oh shit, if I want to change my circumstances around me, then I've got to change my state. I've got to change, and be the person that I know I am. That's it. It was as simple as that. Be the person that I know I am. So what's the definition of a good human, right? Everyone has their own definition. So I made that definition. I said, I'm this human. Yeah. These will be my values, my disciplines, my foundations, all of those things. I am this human. But I'm not these other things. And I'm breaking those patterns because they were the patterns that I was creating. Now, and that's what took me down the path into meditation. And I tried out quite a few and settled on transcendental meditation, which I found that works for me, and everyone should find their own. And it doesn't have to be
100%.
meditation, can be writing, can be whatever, but there should be something that enables them to reflect and,
I journal so much. Like I've got books in this cupboard right now here.
And that's a good thing to do. Exactly. So, I went down, started saying, all right, I'm going to, be more reflective and just try and create some kind of space for me to understand. So I needed to kind of open space from within, right? I mean, I think that's to your point about allowing the light to, but I knew I had awoken something within. So I then went on this kind of intentional journey now. So then intent becomes very important in this process.
Yeah.
So intent immediately is a explicit statement that you are going to pursue a course of action. Whether the outcome that's here nor there, but the intent is important because that then sets you up for the process you must then undertake. The process is the discipline to stay in the process. And if you can do that, the joy comes from through that process, right? It's really quite interesting. It's a bit like going to the gym. Yeah. You might want to get big, but whatever. But actually the joy is going through that. And it's painful to begin with. Yeah. Because you're exercising a different muscle, you're exercising a bunch of things, right? But the more you do it, the more sophisticated you become You become more efficient in certain things, but you're going to then push it a little bit more because that's where growth is. You're going to push it a bit more. Yeah. And that discipline enables you to actually cultivate that level of growth. Right. So I went down this path. Now, I remember thinking to myself very intentionally, I'm breaking with what I did before. And I took a harsh decision, actually. I was like, what kind of environment do I surround myself in? I really kind of did almost a 360-degree diagnostic on John Shewell. And I found that actually I was unintentionally cultivating an unhealthy environment that was making me unhealthy.
Mm.
So I took a really harsh decision to not only cut myself from that environment, it meant also I was cutting myself out of a huge social group that associated themselves around these things. And I remember I got lambasted for it, you know, and
Yeah.
people kind of said, "Oh, here he goes." I got a lot of grief over it, but I thought to myself, look,
Especially because you were
if
quitting alcohol. Is that like part of all of that? Like
that was a big one. Yeah, I got mocked like you wouldn't believe,
fair
right? But
enough.
I thought to myself, true friends would never do that anyway. So that was an easy one for me, when that behavior reared its ugly head. I thought to myself, this is not a real friendship.
Yeah,
This is a
totally.
superficial one built around liquid, to
Yeah.
get intoxicated, So, fuck it. I'm not too bothered,
Confronting.
So it was a bit confronting, but it was also liberating because it was the first time I'd learnt the power of no. It's an
Yeah.
important word to say no. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, forget it. And then that
Yeah.
when you start doing that, you're putting down some clear boundaries. And that's so important. Yeah. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to change my life. But, the true test then ran for another 12 months, because, bear in mind, I was at a low point. I was like financially fucked. I was emotionally not in a great place. But emotionally, I was getting better. I was like, I could feel things improving emotionally by a long way. I was getting clear-headed, clear-eyed about certain things. I was changing my habits into more kind of positive, disciplined approach. But the kind of wealth side of things, the prosperity around wealth wasn't quite forthcoming. And I thought, what's going on here? And that took about 12 months, almost to the day, when WeFox showed up. And this is the point I was trying to make. So when I spotted WeFox, something just triggered in me, right? And I thought to myself, this is an interesting company. And then I had this kind of really hilarious conversation with them saying, look, I don't have this experience. And it was just the exchange. I was like, this is the place where I'm meant to be, right? This is part of my journey. Really, it seems so
Right.
weird to say it now,
Yeah.
but it really felt right. And I was like, no, I think this is part of it. Anyway, they didn't give me the job straight away. It took another 4 months, I think, before I actually landed them, right? 4 or 5 months. But I remember sitting down with a good mate of mine, Austin Hunter. Shout out to him as well. Guys, one of my most wonderful,
Name.
beautiful mates. Yeah, he's really a great guy. And we were sitting down
Like it.
over coffee, and he really is wonderful, wonderful human. And I was sitting down, and we're having coffee, and I told him about this, and he'd been tracking, what I've been doing, and he was like really encouraging me and stuff, saying, "Look, you're doing a great thing. Keep going, John. Hang in there, mate." Anyway, I told him about WeFox stuff, and he was one of the very few, like, true mates that supported that. Like, he goes, no, you seem to really want this. He goes, John, he goes, you know about the story of Caesar coming to England? I said, oh, burn the boats. And he goes, yeah. Do you know the story, right? Caesar turns up to England, right, knowing that, the English, the natives there are a bit hard to subdue, right? But, he knew that they needed a do or die moment, right? So, as the legend goes, he orders his troops, as they land on the shores, to burn the boats. So they're either taking this land or they're dying
Oh,
there.
yeah.
Yeah, so Austin says to me, yeah, burn the boats. And I remember starting going, are you sure? And he's like, John, why not? You've come this far. Why don't you push it even further? And I thought about it. And what he meant and what we both understood and I went and executed pretty much straight away was this. I canceled the lease of my apartment. I packed everything up and flew to Germany. All right.
You
I
did
hadn't
say
got
that.
the job. Yeah, I hadn't got the job. And I rocked up at WeFork saying, hey, look, we've been talking about this. Just give me my desk. Tell me where I'm going to work. And the blokes were like thinking, oh, you're cute. Anyway, we had a chat and they didn't give me the job. And I was like, fuck, I'm stuck. I'm in Berlin. I've just packed up everything in the UK to come here. And there's mad idea thinking that I'll burn the boats. Anyway, so I had to figure it out. And so I kind of, basically bummed around a bit, around Europe. But then the call came. They called me up one day and said, hey, listen, mate, can you come in and help us with a workshop? We're having we need a bit of help here with someone to come troubleshoot. And again, there was no job on the table, but I knew, I don't know why, I just knew that if I get into that workshop and they had the investors there and stuff, and it was hilarious. I got into this workshop and again, I didn't know anything about insurtech, but I knew a thing or two about how you build a reputation, how you put
Mm.
that together
Yeah,
and scale it
yeah,
up, right?
yeah.
And there was this management consultant on the whiteboard and had all these investors and their C-suite sitting around watching and nodding approvingly. And this bloke's got this, saying, right, this is how we do it. This is how, and I sat there, an hour had gone past. And everyone's like, again, nodding and going, oh, yeah, this is a great idea. And I couldn't make sense of this fucking whiteboard. So I said, excuse me, can I just make an observation and a comment? And the bloke said, sure. He goes, do you want to come up? And I said, I'd love to. I said, can I write on your whiteboard? And he goes, yeah. So I got up and I wiped everything off the whiteboard. Right. And he was like, what the? Yeah, I
You.
wiped everything off. And I said, listen, I don't understand this gobbledygook. Right. But I'll tell you what I do understand. And I just drew a big curve, right? Just a line that went like that. And he goes, what the heck's that? And I said, this is called the narrative arc. This is the only thing you need to understand. Where do you want to get to? That's the arc point.
Mm.
And we build the narrative from where we are today and we work backwards. All the investors went, we understand that. And I just put the pen down. Blake went and said to me, oh, how do we do that? And I said, send me the contract and I'll come back in and we'll get it done. And that was it. I knew at that
I
point
love it.
that was,
So cool.
and that was like, I remember in the moment doing it without even thinking. And it was, when I look back on it now and telling the story, I'm like, geez, that's a pretty ballsy thing to do. I didn't
It was
know these guys. I
ballsy.
was in a room full of investors, and I just walked up, wiped off everything he'd put there on the board. I'd essentially basically said to him, this is garbage. I'm going to erase it.
Mm.
So I physically went and erased his complex thinking, right? Which I'm sure it was absolutely beautiful, right? But it made zero sense to me. And I just drew this one line narrative arc, right? This is about telling a story, right? What's your story? And everything distills down to that. We all have a story. I'm telling you a story about me and my journey. They're trying to, so, and suddenly I knew at that moment that I had basically why I was there, why I knew I was going to get, that I was essentially understanding the power of storytelling, that it's actually inherently a human thing. We go through it, but you
Totally.
become alive to it, then how you bring it into the real world. And I
Yeah.
remember walking out of that room, right, and I knew they're going to send me within 2 weeks. Bang, got a phone call from the I think it was the chief strategy officer, right? Really nice guy called Lieutenant Travers, and said, we want to offer you the contracts 2 months. I remember laughing, thinking, ain't 2 months, mate. I didn't say it, but I was like,
It's gonna
you
be like
watch.
5 years. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But, like,
Yeah, I
for
was like, I'm
me,
going to
like,
make you famous.
yeah, totally, and you've done that, and, you did it. But for me, I coming back to the inner light and the invitation into the test, you passed the test in terms of, like, when you're invited into the test and you're going through your next one, and we're gonna have to do a part 2 of this. We did talk about this, in terms of, 'cause we're nearly an hour, and I feel like we're gonna go for another hour on John part 2. and you were open to it. So I'm gonna hold you to account on it, because I feel like this is the first
Please do.
part, and we're into the then we're going to the second part, because cycle of John now, like, that's another cycle, and I want to give it, like, the space, if you like, the space and time for it. But for me, I know you were like, when I said, oh, you kind of passed the test, if you like, but invitation into the test, and you've taken on the test, you went down the dark road. But where I'm going with this, and I know you'll have a point of view, because that's what I love about you, and we're like, I feel like we've only met a few times like this, but I do feel like certain people I'm meeting on the pod, I'm like, if I met with you in person, it'd be like, John, I've known you for like years and years. It's just like that connection. And listening to your story now, it's like you're telling my story. And I feel like you're telling so many stories and other people's stories, in terms of everyone's got their story, but just the way you describe it, I'm like, oh my goodness. And a book is coming from you. That is my message to you from here. Like, something's telling me a book is coming. I've got a bit of a strong sixth sense. But back to what I was talking about, is that you, in that moment, you were just yourself. Like, you were your authentic truth. You were who you always meant to be. It comes back to that piece of paper where you were like, like this, when
Yeah.
you wrote it down, like, it feels like that is who you
Again,
are. And it was ballsy, but it was just, this is you.
yeah, again, I think that so the invitation is an invitation to step into your self with a capital S, right? Your true self. That's the
Yeah.
invitation. Here's the thing though, and again, my own reflections on this, and just my own, that when one's invited to step into their self, that truly is scary. That's an act of courage, because
I
often
agree.
most people aren't living themselves.
No,
They've
I
seen
haven't been.
something on social media or on Hollywood or something like that and say, I'm going to be like that. Yeah. And to step into one's truly authentic self is an act of immense courage. Yeah.
I
And to
agree.
hold that space, right? And to walk that path, come what may. Now, I've come across, thankfully, in my little life, some amazing humans that do that and do it so effortlessly. For me, it was a journey to arrive in that place. And but when I understood that, what I also understood is that that process of awakening and being invited into my space, right? You're essentially being invited into your power. Now, I think that's what
Like,
scares people, to really step into your power, because once you step into your power, you have a great responsibility now,
uh,
and a responsibility to yourself to hold yourself accountable, to set yourself the standard that only you can live up to, which is the standard of yourself, capital S. What is that? Yeah. And I think owning that, and being in that space is not just empowering, right? And being in a powerful place to be. That's when your light truly begins to shine. But that is when the journey truly only begins, right? Because you have to remain so present to that, right? And, this might sound a bit woo-woo, but honestly, I wasn't a particularly religious person. I still am, but I certainly began to lean in towards faith of some
uh,
form. And I started to really and I did a lot of work around trying to learn, like, how does the mind and body function? And I read a lot of stuff on it. I'm by no means an expert, more a curious student of the topics. But also I started kind of dabbling into the world of physics and, things and
yeah,
where does human
yeah.
relationships sit into this? Yeah. And all of this stuff, right? So, and that's an ongoing journey of me just trying to
Mm,
understand really where am I in amongst all of this, right? But the thing is this, what I began to appreciate for me and only me was that if I paid attention, because attention and intention go together.
mm,
If I paid attention, there are enough signals going on around me. This is my belief.
mm.
It's like, and I call it the universe whispering to you.
Same. Well,
But
that's what I do.
yeah, but you cannot hear the universe whisper in a cacophony. You've got to really tune in and listen very quietly and heed the signals. And this is what I believe they mean by being present. Being
Agreed.
present to yourself and really staying in that place of authenticity and power, which is
Mm,
yourself.
mm,
But when you do that, you are truly present and you're listening and you're having a conversation with the universe very quietly. Some call it prayer, you
mm.
know. This has manifested in different ways. This is, again, these are just my own reflections, right? And I have integrated these, into my way of living. And it's probably not perfect. It's not for everyone for sure, right? And I don't preach this to anybody. I don't believe in that. I think people should find what works for them and pursue that. This is what happens to work for me. But as a result of that, I'm now more open to the ambiguity of life. And that makes me feel a lot more comfortable now, because now I feel like I've cultivated a kind of toolkit of being really comfortable in uncertainty. Yeah. But knowing that, and this is the really cool part, I think, because when you're in your, or you stepped into yourself, you've anchored. And that gives you a degree of knowing. And then the quest then truly is, and it is kind of a quest. And I think this is why people write these stories about, search of the Holy Grail and stuff like that. I mean, really, that's a search for self. Those stories, I mean, if you read the Bible carefully, it kind of is more like a self-help guide.
Yeah,
It
totally.
just, people interpret it in weird and wonderful ways. That's conversation for somewhere else.
So
Yeah.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to pause you. I'm not going to stop you. I'm going to pause you because I feel like we could keep going and going. But I want to let you. I'm giving you one more minute in terms of to close the part one off, and I want you to give us some sort of, what's the word? Teaser's the wrong word, but if you think about it, like in terms of into the next part of the next episode, in terms, or the like in terms of the next cycle of John, like you've talked around what is it, to give us some sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like we've talked a lot, we've done inner light, the invitation into the test. What is this next? What are you calling this next part? Or you don't have the answer yet?
Gosh, that's a great question, and yeah, I think I'd be disingenuous if I
Answered
knew
it,
straight
yeah.
away.
Yeah, fair enough.
Think that Yeah, I think it's another version. Um, it's still me. It's not like but it's stepping
Let's stop there.
into, yeah. I think we should.
I love that. That's perfect, because then it's going to be like, all right, part two. So I'm going to end it here because it's an hour, and just because then we'll keep everyone waiting for the next, because this is Formless in its finest in terms of just that whole, and I'm not trying to, like, your past hour, like this is, yeah, it's incredible. So your story and the way you're articulating it, this is what it's all about, right?
Well, I mean, it's certainly what it's been like for me. So
And it's
again,
been like everything you're saying is what it's been like for me. I just haven't been share bits, but I haven't been able to, like, I'm listening to your story going, like, all the, like, not everything, but everything that you're like, you had a dream. I haven't had a dream. I've had other things happen. Like, you've had situations with people and connections, and you lost your connections, and like, this is lots of different things where I think we can all relate. And yeah, anyway, it's a fascinating conversation. So on that note, I'm not going to ask how do we find out more about you and do all of that. I'm going to be Stay tuned. You and I are going to have a quick conversation now and lock in the next session. And stay tuned,
I'm looking
everybody,
forward.
for the second. We always said it would be a part two, so we'll be sharing our part two soon. Thank you. John.
Thank you.